Thank you all for joining us today for the August virtual Boston Tableau user group. I have a lot of great stuff planned for the day and are very excited to have you all here. Before we get into the presentation, just have a few quick announcements. So the dates for the Tableau conference have been announced. It's going to be happening from November 9th through November 11th. And once again, it'll be fully virtual and free to everyone. I believe registration opens today. I think it opened at noon. So go out, register, and join the fun. We also wanted to highlight some recent achievements from our local Boston community. Since the last time we met, we had 3 members of our community have their viz selected as Tableau Viz of the Days. Kate Brown for her viz on golf courses in the area and her mission to play all 48 municipal courses in Massachusetts. David Borzik for his visualization on cryptocurrencies and how each of them have performed over the last few years. And Brandon Cornell for his visualization on the world's most famous drag queen, RuPaul. Also want to give a big congratulations to our own John Whitmer, who was selected as a Tableau featured author in the most recent cohort. So congratulations, John, and congratulations to Kate, David, and Brandon. So today we are thrilled to have with us the one and only Emily Kund to talk on a subject that she's very passionate about, accessibility. So Emily is an absolute rock star in the data community. She's the founder of the Tableau Fringe Festival, co-founder of the Tableau World podcast, co-founder of Data Plus Women and Data Plus Women DC. She's a Tableau ambassador, and she is both Tableau certified and certifiably awesome. She's currently working as a Tableau enablement consultant at Red Hat and also as an accessibility advocacy lead. So very excited to have Emily with us today.
Well, thank you so much. I need to take you around with me everywhere because that intro was awesome. All right. Well, I am really excited to be here today. Just somebody put in the chat if you can see my screen. Oh, now you can see my screen. Fantastic. Okay. So today I'm talking about accessibility, and it's really meant to be a primer. And I love this little graphic before we kind of move through what we're talking about. I love this graphic. It's a persona spectrum from Microsoft, who provides such a great amount of information on accessibility and how they have implemented it as part of their whole product development. But I love this because I think it really helps. It helped me, at least, really understand that it's not just about blind people. It's not just this permanent situation or scenario. It can be permanent, temporary, or situational. And I love the examples for each one of these. So I thought that this was a really nice way to kind of set up this presentation, because accessibility could be for those who have permanent challenges or situational. And let's see here. Oh, too much. I went too far. Oh, technology. There we go. Okay, so what we're talking about today. What does accessibility mean? Some high-level requirements. We're going to go through a case study, but I promise you it will be fun and not like, I won't be sounding like Charlie Brown's teacher. Some simple ways to be more accessible, some challenges, and then resources and references. And as I was putting together, as I was actually iterating on this presentation, I was actually Googling how to make presentations more accessible. And one of the tips I learned was that give a copy to the audience at the start of your presentation, so that way they can use the presentation how they need in order to access and understand the information. So at the bottom of this slide here, oh, but now I just think about it, I'm not sure that that's clickable. Oh, such a great idea, perhaps gone wrong. But you'll get a copy of this slide deck after we're done. All right, so I'm your guide on today's talk. As Brian mentioned, I'm an accessibility advocate and working group lead for a DataViz ally group, and I'm here to talk with you about accessibility. So what is it anyway? And it's really about providing the most similar experience for as many people or all people. And so that's really what we're talking about when we talk about making things accessible. But then I think there's this question of, especially in data visualization, so like, why should we try or even care? Like, this is a visual medium. And I think this is my best answer to this question. And that's my daughter, Katie, who's 10. This was us on a weekend getaway. And that's her with her cotton candy milkshake. But Katie is not only like one of the loves of my life, but she is one of the reasons why I'm passionate about this, because Katie has dyslexia and ADHD. And it's just really frustrating as a mom, or very sad to have your daughter say, but mommy, how am I supposed to know what those letters mean? They look alike. And that's because of somebody's design choice that she had to ask that question. And so while that's a very personal type of reason why I care and why I'm so passionate about this, from a business perspective, it's not like people go around raising their hand saying, hey, I'm colorblind. Hey, I have ADHD. Hey, I have this or that, because some people may not even know. And so why should you try or care? Because there was a senior advisor in a meeting that we were in, and we made our charts, we made our dashboards colorblind friendly. And so he was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. I can see what you all are talking about instead of just politely nodding my head. And so it's for my daughter, Katie, it's for my dad, it's for me, but it's also for the person who I don't know. And that's why I want to make these experiences, to the best that I can, more accessible and similar for as many people as possible. All right, so isn't it just about color blindness and screen readers? No, it is so much more. And I know that those are the two big topics that tend to get a lot of talk, and they are super important, but it is more than that. And so we're going to dive into the different aspects and some ways that you can address them. It's also about limited vision. So being able to see, but not really well, and being deaf and having low dexterity and low comprehension and low reading and epilepsy. Now, some of these may not apply, like if you're deaf, we don't incorporate sound in a lot of our visualizations. But if you do, you need to consider, how would that experience be similar for someone who's deaf? And so these are not, as I was actually looking through this last night, I was thinking these are really the outcomes, right? So Katie has dyslexia, which causes her to have issues reading text. So she would fall in that low reading. She's not going to say, I have a low reading issue, but I have dyslexia, which causes those bullet points on the screen. And so that may not mean much, but for me, that was an aha of, you know, they're not going to present themselves in clear bulleted fashion like this when you're doing work for other users. But knowing that we have people around us in our audience that may have something that leads to one of these. And that's why it's important to the extent possible, address it. I'm not going to go over the screen reader, but when you get this deck, if you want to experience the screen reader, if you haven't or if you don't currently use a screen reader, I think that you'll have a new appreciation for using screen readers. It's a SEPTA table, which is the Philadelphia like mass transit system, and it's a table of their times for their shuttles. So you'll be able to see what that sound, or see or hear what that sounds like, and experience that for yourself. So I totally would recommend doing that if you haven't. So let's get into some high-level requirements. So this is WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. There are really 4 main requirements. Your work needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And so I'll dive into kind of what makes up some of that in a bit. But then in the US, we also have Section 508 of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it was recently amended, probably within the last couple of years, and is now written to address WCAG level AA, which I'll show you in a second. A lot of people believe that this really only applies to government. And so therefore, they don't have to comply with Section 508. But I think that's a slippery slope, because if you do business with the federal government, or I think, and this I would like fact check, but I think if you also receive government funds, you are required to comply. I know if you do work with the federal government. So if you are a consulting company and you have a consulting contract with the government, federal government, your work is required to be compliant with Section 508. But there's the compliance aspect and the must do, but then there's also this, but like, what's the right thing to do? And is compliance what's going to drive my actions, or is it having as many people as possible see my work? Realizing that you don't know who's in the audience, in terms of you may not know who's in the audience, and so that may be a key decision maker now or in the future, and wouldn't it be nice if they could understand your work? So while it may not be required, in a sense, it is a good thing to do. And this is one area that, I mean, if you have web content, you fall under WCAG. So it's a little, I feel like it's a little muddy sometimes, but I would, to the extent possible, try to make your work accessible. And then I think you'll be in a better position than not. All right. So what's required? This slide is super small, but I have a link that's built in so that you'll be able to access this on your own. But essentially what I was showing is that in that black box there is what 508 covers. And these are the 3 levels of WCAG. And so for perceivable, some of the guidelines are providing a text alternative. So that's that alt text. Time-based media, providing alternatives to video or audio content, captioning, adaptable, is it a logical structure? Is it distinguishable? Like not relying on color, for example. Operable is making it keyboard accessible. Having enough time to take an action built into whatever the thing is that's being built or used. Limiting the number of flashes per second, so that way there are no issues with seizures. Is it navigable? Understandable? Is it readable? Predictable? Is there an input assistance? And then robust, is it compatible? And so that was super high level, but I encourage you to kind of dig in, and I'll also have a resource for you at the end, which I think frames it up really nicely for data visualization. So stay tuned for that. So we're going to dive into a case study. So what I want to know in the chat is, do you think this visualization is accessible? Vote yes or no. Man, I'm seeing some no's. Dang it. Oh, I see a yes. Thank you, Mike. You're my favorite person now. Yes, but you feel like it's a trap. Okay. All right. So the answer is no. And it made me super sad, because as I was putting this together, first of all, I know it was a trap. When I was putting this together, like, I was really the primary audience. I don't visualize data a lot anymore. But I was like super excited about this. It was around funding disinformation. I was all about it. I was so happy that I did this visualization. And for me, I'm like, this is not super complex. So I thought that It was fine. And then my friend Frank, who is also on the Ally working group with me, he was putting together this audit and asked for volunteers. And I was like, hey, let me do a self audit and then you can do an audit. And he did a full audit of this visualization. And oof, as the kids say, that was something else. There was so much red. Um, and the worst thing is, I didn't even know it. And so this red, what this red actually represents is how a screen reader was reading this visualization, which blew my mind. So this is what I saw. And actually, that's kind of, saw is not actually the appropriate term. So that's what I experienced versus what people with screen readers experienced. That's a big difference, right? Like, that's massive. And so I'm going to dig in and show you or kind of talk through some of the critical issues, not even some of these, it would be great if you could fix this type of thing. So here were some of my perceivable failures. And so these are written in the form of the requirement. And the reason why I'm going through this with you is because this is pretty basic for a visualization, right? Like, it's circles, it's bar graphs with reference lines, it's a pie chart, and text. That's it. So here is where I went wrong. There wasn't enough contrast on the chart elements and the text. And I can kind of see this now. The text size, it needed to be readable. I was using an 11-point font. The recommended font size is 12. Information was available non-visually with screen reader or braille support. Well, we saw the red, and that wasn't it. The color choice was friendly to colorblind users. Now, this one I thought, well, wait a minute, these are blues and grays, and so why? But there wasn't enough contrast between them. So that was one of the reasons why this palette was challenging. Color is not the only channel for certain information. So you see here, I pretty much use color for I didn't like double encode a lot of things, if any. So color was it. And as I thought about this last night, I was like, gosh, because I was going back through this, I was like, but I understand why I did this. It's because I feel like I was conditioned to not double encode, right? Like, be smart with how you use this, how you use your space and encoding. And so I don't know, maybe there was something that stuck in my mind about double encoding, but actually double encoding works really well for accessibility purposes. So while traditionally we may not like to see patterns in bars, that actually is super helpful for accessibility purposes. So if I had used shapes and color, that would have been much better. So meaningful elements needed to be discerned. That was an issue that we had in my visualization, and the appropriate use of spacing. It was too squished up. That's not the technical term. But so those are just the critical perceivable failures. If I go to critical operable failures, chart is interactive through only multiple means. I mean, did I write that correctly? It's really like, oh, right, that's the requirement. It has to be interactive through multiple ways instead of just, so keyboard and mouse versus just mouse. And it was only accessible through mouse because I even had really beautiful, like I was complimented on my tooltips, but you could only access them through a mouse. Instructions were provided for interaction. Well, I didn't really provide instructions. Keyboard focus indication was easy to see. Absolutely not. That was all over the place. Appropriate use of tab stops. Now, when Frank highlighted this issue to me, I was like, what are you even talking about? And what I didn't know, so the requirement is every chart element must not have its own tab stop. So the chart can't be skipped. And at least one tab stop should be provided if a data table succeeds the chart. And what Frank told me was, look, there's an issue in Tableau with tab stops, like you can skip charts. And so that's something that's kind of out of my control and is a point that I need to follow up on to see, like, how can I deal with that? What is a workaround? So that's kind of a pin for future work for me. And then special actions, brushing, zooming, filtering that use custom chart controls have UI alternative. And like, I really didn't do anything special, but this failed. And I think it was part of just the nature, kind of how Tableau is built. So then I've gotten through P and O. I still have more failures. So on the understandable, the axis labels need to be presented and clear. The truncations are labeled correctly. Appropriate controls are provided for the task. Eliminate unnecessary functionality. So those tooltips, if they're not necessary, turn them off, as just one example. If the chart interacts with its surroundings, the purpose and function is clearly communicated. So if you do drill downs, for example, that needs to be clear, like click here to drill down to see more detail type of thing. And then from a robust failure perspective, so this one, the first one is an automatic failure if you have any other failures, which I clearly did. But this last one, though, made me go, semantically valid use of document elements. Basically, if it functions like a button, it needs to be a button. And what I had done wasn't so much on the button side, but I had actually removed some headers. So I had removed titles, I used text elements because I wanted it to look a certain way, not realizing that because it wasn't identified as a header, it wasn't being read like a header. I had no idea because in my mind, funding disinformation, ? That's the header, because that's what I saw and I experienced. And so for me, this was one of my easy takeaways of like, okay, well, next time I'm going to use my titles and my headers to like actually act like headers. So you can see how this pretty non-complex visualization failed hard. So here's like the summary. Now that I've taken you through all of that, here are the high-level issues, and I say written by a layperson. So like if you're not in it, there wasn't enough blank space, aka white space. Headings weren't headings because I hid the title and used text and formatted an empty block. The order of my viz was crazy. Color was the primary means for encoding information. Axes and labeling was confusing, and there weren't instructions on how to interact with the viz. So I boiled all of that and down to those probably 6 bullet points there. Now, that's my interpretation. If you were to ask Frank Olavaski, he would probably come up with something different because he has such a deep knowledge of this. But for me, these were the things that if I fixed them, then I think this would be more accessible. So, holy cow, that's a lot of failures. And how are you even supposed to know, or how was I even supposed to know, or even create an accessible visualization? Like, you might be thinking about this because I was actually thinking about this going through all of those points where I failed or my visualization failed. And it can be a lot. I get it. But here's the thing. Real talk, it might be hard, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And so here are some tips. And by the way, I think one of the biggest points to know is that you may likely never have a fully accessible visualization because there are so many circumstances and to that would present itself, or so many challenges, and your audience might dictate so what you do. And so, I'm not like granting permission to like never try, but I think we should try to the extent that we can, but know that getting to 100% might be almost impossible, but get to 98 or 99 or 80, that's way better than where we were before. So color blindness. I think everybody has seen this before. Check your palettes, and I actually love red and green. I think you can use it when you have high contrast red and green. So you can check to see what your visualizations look like. For low vision, this is, I think, pretty common, is especially in visualizations, we use more of a standard font than script, but if at all possible, avoid using decorative or script type fonts. In the same way, for vision, make sure that contrast isn't just on the colors, but it's on the color of the font versus the background. You can see this is super hard to read, and I have pretty decent vision. These are my computer glasses. So this is like, I wanted to put this in a table that was like super simple. It doesn't, it's more involved than this, but I think, again, if you are to think about like, okay, if they have limited vision, what should I do? So kind of giving you this high level. So if there's blindness, making sure that you can use a screen reader or voiceover. For color blindness, using contrasting colors and or double encoding. For limited vision, you select a readable font, use contrast in white space or blank space. For deafness, use a visual display and don't rely on audio or captioning. For low dexterity, where they're unable to use a pointing device like a mouse, make it accessible with a keyboard. And then for low comprehension, use annotation to help understand. For low reading, use high contrast and be thoughtful in your font choice. And then if someone has epilepsy, like seizures, then do not have more than 3 flashes in 1 second. So that's the high level table. But here's some actionable tips for accessibility. Alt text your images. I actually read something the other day, so I wanted to make sure I put it in here. I always think about how do I alt text my image? Like, what is too much? Because I've seen different things, right? Different pieces of advice. But this one piece of advice that I recently saw just really clicked for me. And so maybe it'll help you too. And that is, close your eyes and describe the image. And I had actually alt texted that cow, and I used that process, and I was like, oh yeah, okay, that actually worked for me. So that's something that might work for you as well. Contrast your colors. This is linked in the presentation, but I love this contrast ratio checker. I would always, and I've got this in my resources section, this link, but then also webaim.org is another great resource that has contrast checkers. But you want, in this particular case, you want to be in that green. So that black and white is the gold standard. Whereas you can see the contrast for red and green down here, not so good. Use blank space or white space. And this is because it helps detect differences. And so I even find myself forgetting to do this because it's just not natural yet for me. But it is good. You can see clearly there's a difference between that teal and purple and green in that second chart. Now, this is my favorite, and I'm actually doing a whole separate, like I'm diving into this on a separate one, but font choice and how we construct sentences matter. So fonts should be able to accommodate increased sizes without loss of readability or functionality. That's kind of the requirement. But this is where, Katie had this issue. And I don't know what typeface it was, but Arial, which is so commonly used, you can see here the illustration, the capital I and the L's look the same. Whereas Verdana, it's different. And so even thinking about, do those letters look the same? Really quickly, the top two aspects of typefaces that I can remember are this mirroring. So do they look the same, like that capital I and the L? Or I'm sorry, that's not mirroring, that's lookalike, imposter. Mirroring is the D and the B. So do they look the same if you were to flip it? And if so, then you might want to choose a different typeface, because if you have an issue with dyslexia, for example, where your brain will flip it, it's hard to read. But then I also love this this example on the right-hand side where we have Arial, Tahoma, and Verdana. And you can see that there's more spacing with Verdana than there is with Arial. And so having space is also a really great practice and something we should use or have when we're using fonts. So those are some considerations for when you pick out your next typeface.
Good question from the group, Emily.
Yeah.
Kind of related to color and then also text. Brandon and Emily kind of chimed in on this. So Tableau pushes all the text to a subtle, like some brilliant color of gray to be in between the white background.
Will, I can hardly hear you.
Oh, sorry, my mic fell off. Do you recommend darkening the text in a work format, or is it more detailed than that from the default Tableau text?
So, yeah, if it's subtle gray, like very subtle, I would change it. Like, I'd have to look into like how that, like the use case around when it pushes the text to that very subtle gray, but definitely change the color to that dark charcoal, if that makes sense. Again, it's all about that contrast. So obviously dark charcoal text on a color text on a black background, that's not going to be contrasted enough. But if you've got that white background, use the dark charcoal, that's great amount of contrast. So feel free to format that workbook with colors that contrast enough. Like, if Tableau, for whatever reason, if there's not enough contrast in the default, change it. All right. Oh, so the black and white contrast can be harsh on monitors. Sorry, I was like kind of reading through some of the follow-on there. And yes, that's right. That's what I've also heard, is the black and white can be harsh, but that's where you go with like that dark charcoal on white. Or maybe that, like in my mind, I'm picking that like light white, you know which one I'm talking about, right under the bright white. But again, when in doubt, test it, right? Like test it out. So check that contrast to see if it works for you. Another actionable tip, thank you also for the question. That was great. Another actionable tip is use annotations. They aid in understanding. So I just pulled this chart that I thought looked pretty cool off of webaim.org. And on the surface, no clue. I mean, it looks like an architectural design. It looks so pretty. But if I add some annotation, now I can start to see, oh, that big bubble is supposed to be a West Coast switch that caused an issue. It's helping me understand. So that is kind of an egregious example, but you can see how that annotation helps your visualization. So test your flashes. If you are creating visualizations with animations or Flash, test that out. There's a link to a testing tool, which it runs on Windows, or if you have Boot Camp. And again, that's in the references references and resources section. Also, I've tested it out, and Tableau's animations, at least when I tested it, complied with the WCAG standards of no more than 3 flashes per second. So you're good there if you use the standard animation in Tableau. And then I think this is my final tip. Simple is better, right? Like, I know data people, or especially certain groups of people, like I remember my finance people, they want lots of numbers and they want to do this themselves, and give me all of it and I'll analyze it. But really, from an accessibility perspective, simple is much better. Think about that screen reader that has to read through all of this versus the screen reader that has to read through this. It's much easier. All right, so I wanted to cover some challenges. The first one is interactivity. Can a screen reader read it? And that's a challenge that we have. And so I'm presenting these challenges only because I think we just need to acknowledge them, because we have a ton of smart people in Tableau world and also data visualization. So I know that there's somebody out there who's going to say, I'm going to take this challenge on and figure it out. And so that's why I wanted to present these. These, I think, are like the big 3. Chart types. Network diagrams and other complex charts aren't easily translatable into a table or easily understood or read. So how do you take that a really complex Sankey or a chord diagram or violin plot or whatever it is, and how do you make that accessible? I think that that's I'd love to see somebody do that. And then big data. So overwhelming somebody with so many numbers, putting it all out there on the dashboard makes it hard for people to understand, and really simplifying it down, depending on the type of dashboard you're creating. If it's for, driving in, showing those insights, you may not need all the numbers. You just need to present the information to get to the conclusion or the next step. All right, so some simple things to make your dashboards more accessible. Note that I don't say fully accessible. I think this is probably the one that I wish I had done, and I have to instill in myself because I haven't instilled this as like a routine practice. You can order your dashboard how someone would read it from top to bottom, or you can modify the XML. And I think somebody may have put a link in the chat about that. I also have linked Christy Martini's blog post about modifying the XML so that you can reorder the zones. This is something I would love for Tableau to do, is to make it easy. Like in my mind, I'm like, let's just like change the order on the dashboard layout with the hierarchy thing, but but we're not there yet. So one of my tips is to number your worksheets in the order in which they should be read on the dashboard. That's super low tech way of doing it if you're not comfortable or can't modify the XML. Use titles, not text boxes. Don't use images as titles. Again, images can't be read unless you alt text them. So I would just say, if possible, don't use images as titles. Add captions and legends, double encode. Provide instructions on how to use. This one is so important. And it's not even from it is from an accessibility perspective, but I see so many dashboards just generally where it's just like, all right, here's the dashboard, you figure out how to use it. And it's like, oof, like now we have to have sessions and now we have to talk about how to use it. Or people are, depending on the audience, they might be afraid to use it. So providing instruction is just a good practice, I think. Format your tooltips into narratives. And the other one is, just because you can doesn't mean you should. So just because you can do complex charts doesn't mean you should do them in all cases. Just because you can viz 70 million data points doesn't mean you should in all cases. So I'm almost done here. I've got resources. Chartability from Frank is an amazing resource. You should all bookmark it. You'll be able to see the full audit of my visualization there. The Chartability workbook, that's the audit that tested my viz. That's available for you to download and use for your own. I've got the DataViz Ally Resource Shortlist, Contrast Ratio Checker, and WCAG 2 requirements chart, as well as some other reference materials that I used when putting this presentation together. And finally, last 2 points. If it can feel overwhelming, but it can also feel innovative. And if I think about curb cuts and captioning, those are all things that benefit me now, but they started out for an accessibility purpose. And then just take one action. You don't have to go from 0 to fully accessible overnight, but take 1 or 2 actions, because those small steps will lead to big change. And finally, I'd love to connect. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully I did not sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. I was trying to get through a lot of information. I know I ran over my time a little bit. You can scan the QR code and it'll take you to Twitter to connect with me. You can also email me if you have any questions. I promise if I don't know the answer, I will follow up and find it. Thank you.
That was awesome. So a couple questions from the group. Let me jump in with them here.
Yeah.
So the first one is wah 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 wah. I'm just kidding. Sorry, I had to do that. So I had a really good one here, and we talk a lot about touchscreen design as it pertains to mobile vizzes, and you can see those a lot in places. But is a touchscreen helpful for those with low dexterity, or is that just as different? Difficult as a mouse. So should a viz be designed to take that into consideration for desktop?
I think that if you know that your visualizations are going to be consumed on a touch screen, then you should take that into consideration. And here's why I say that. If you think about, but also like, okay, the biggest thing I think out of all of this is know your audience. And so if the audience is you and you're not sharing your visualization out and you don't have any challenges, or you do have challenges and you want to viz accordingly, go for it. But you don't know everything about everyone, right? So depending on your user base, if people have arthritis, like that touch screen, it may be challenging for them. So you may want to think about the demographics of your audience if you know them. I don't know how much there is on touchscreen design though. So that's something that I am curious about now, and I will look into it. Thank you for the question. I hope at least I gave you something to think about.
No, these have been fantastic. As someone myself who's ADHD and tries to facilitate design in my writing, I still learned a ton here, even though with all the resources I have. So the last 2 questions before I kick it back to Brian to close this out and to introduce our doctors and our networking time. Would you recommend making 2 versions of visual? I do this sometimes if I know like my data viz is going to be flat and pasted into a call note. I'll make a printer version with no, like minimal titles and no filters and all that kind of stuff. Would you recommend having 2 versions, one artistic and then one machine readable? And yeah, and to grab the other question, there are any cases where you would need alt text already provided, and what would they be?
Okay, so I'll talk about the artistic and the machine readable. I think that might be fine. That's my opinion on that. I think the bigger question is, and this is the question I think that would be the determining factor, because I think different people may give you a different answer. I think one of the challenges with accessibility is that it's not an either or in a lot of cases. It's up to interpretation. So here I think should be the guiding light on this. Would it be a similar experience? And if it would be a similar experience by having the two dashboards, then I think that that's a good way to go. But if not, then I would think about what are ways that you could make the more artistic one. Are there ways that you can make the more artistic one be more accessible? Are there any cases where you would need alt text for already provided text, and what would they be? I'm not exactly sure I understand that scenario, because if it's already provided.
So why don't we do this in the interest of time, Alex?
Yeah.
You can reach out to Emily. Emily has her contact information there. We want to thank you so much again. This was awesome. We were so excited with this. Thank you again for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. If you have any other questions, I'd love to connect on this. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your discussions.